Who is Dr. Destroyo?
Who is Dr. Destroyo?
Who is Dr. Destroyo?
Who is Dr. Destroyo?
Who is Dr.
Who is Dr. Destroyo? Who is Dr. Destroyo?
Who is Dr. Destroyo?
Who is Dr. Destroyo?
I am Dr. Destroyo. From the Death by Media Man podcast show, it's Dr. Destroyo. The story of the world's first true supervillain. We're telling Dr. Destroyo in sequence every 2 weeks. So if you haven't listened to the first episodes, go back and start there. Then, this will all make a lot more sense. Chapter 9. Tom was dead. Well, he wasn't dead, but he was dying. He was certainly dying more than he was living. His neck was broken, but he was still breathing and moving slightly. But Tom wasn't just dying in that way that we're all dying, like the slow death of our cells and our souls. Tom was dying immediately, right before my eyes. He'd gone somewhere he couldn't come back from. He was still there in the alley with me, but only slightly. And soon he wouldn't be anywhere at all. Under the mask of Dr. Destroyo, Tom was convulsing blood out through his nose and mouth. As his spine buckled with his seizures of pain, his hands lunged out and clawed at the alley floor, clawing so hard Tom's nails cracked and peeled back off his fingers. He couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything. His body was just an autonomic system of shocks and spasms. "Oh my God," I said quietly. I couldn't stop looking at the grotesque angle to which Tom's head was bent back. The mask of Dr. Destroyo looked like a deformed sock puppet, half off the arm. A cold sense of shock wrapped itself around my brain. Everything else just sort of melted away, and inside I went all numb. Numb and dead and cold. Dead like Tom. Cold like a supervillain's heart. I turned to Mr. Scorpio. "You fucking killed him," I shouted angrily, like I'd been betrayed or somehow cheated. I had been cheated. I'd been cheated out of a friendship. Cheated out of a fun game we'd been playing. Because of this asshole. "You fucking killed Dr. Destroyo." I knew he was Tom under the mask, but that wasn't where my mind was right then. Looking back, I'd say maybe it was easier to deal with the doctor being dead rather than my roommate. Or maybe it was the mask that made me feel like it was the doctor who died and not somebody real. Or maybe something had been kicked loose inside my head when Tom had taken that boot to the skull, and now some of my mental wiring was misfiring. Hell, maybe the world had always been like this, and so had I, and we just didn't know it until push came to shove. "He had a bomb," Mr. Scorpio mumbled at me as he stepped back from Tom's twitching body. He sounded a little scared, like maybe he was going into the same shock I was in. "He had a bomb, man. I didn't know what he was gonna do. I thought he was—" "You fucking killed him," I said again, my voice getting louder. And then Mr. Scorpio looked at me. He hadn't even really focused on me before then. His eyes were wide with panic, and he was, what? Scared? Enraged? Shaken up? Freaking the fuck out? All of the above? He was going through something heavy. Of that I was pretty much certain. I could see it on his face, even through the mask. He knew what he'd done. He knew exactly what had happened. He just unintentionally killed a man. Sure, maybe he might have just stopped a costumed villain who was threatening his city with a bomb. But he'd also just broken some idiot's neck. The full scope of the situation, the tragedy, the consequences, the meta-contextual irony, none of it appeared to be lost on Mr. Scorpio. "I didn't mean to kill him," Mr. Scorpio said to me, his voice filling up with panic. "Like fuck you didn't," I snapped angrily at Tom's assailant. "You fucking kicked him to death." "It was an accident." Mr. Scorpio was almost pleading now. He was frustrated, panicking. He wanted me to see what he'd seen. He had a bomb. Everything felt achingly real, like when you cut yourself falling down on the pavement on a really cold day. Like 20 degrees minus 0 Celsius, and you just skinned your palms on the sidewalk. That's what it felt like. Cold, harsh reality bleeding in, or bleeding out, as you watch the red fluid rising from the holes in your body in a thin mist of steam. This was something that couldn't stop being real. We were there. It was all happening. I looked up from Tom and saw the moon, a thin slice of silver in the sky directly overhead. I could see the moon high above the alley through the dark lines of thick black electrical cords that ran like giant spider webs between telephone poles and transistor boxes. We were living the dream. We were down a dark alley, a dead body at our feet. Costumes, bombs, men on the edge of society, on the edge of sanity, men past the edge and still going. But when I looked at Mr. Scorpio, the cold deadness inside me turned into a white, hot rage. Numbness surrendered to anger, a sort of slow, agonizing fury that started in my hypothalamus and spread down to my heart. This stupid guy in his stupid costume. He killed my friend. He was playing dress-up crime fighter, and he killed my friend. He'd killed the doctor, the world's first real supervillain, before he'd even had a chance to be really real. My roommate, my buddy, the scourge of the city. Was it Tom or Dr. Destroyo on the ground? My brain couldn't keep it straight. And this other guy, he thought he was a hero? He was a murderer. Just a murderer in a stupid mask. I jabbed a finger at Mr. Scorpio's protected chest. You fucking killed him. You fucking killed him. Mr. Scorpio pulled away from me and drew out his shock rod. 2.5 feet of a slim plastic tube with a couple of little metal nubs on one end. There was a trigger in the handle, and when he thumbed the trigger, a little lick of blue lightning crackled between the metal nubs. My heart was a cataclysm of a drum solo. There was a cold sweat down my back and what felt like fire in my veins. Everything felt like fiction, like falling backwards into deep water forever. I could see the spark of electricity in his weapon, and I could see the panic in his eyes. And then Mr. Scorpio swung at me with his stick, and I went sprawling backwards. I slipped on something as I went. Tom's body, Dr. Destroyo's body under my feet. Tom twitched a bit more, still slowly running out the last bits of agony he had inside himself. I slipped on Tom and fell backwards onto the ground. Mr. Scorpio lunged at me, waving his shock rod through the space I'd filled, his legs tangling with mine as I fell. This was not the poetry of the superhero fist fight. This was a couple of kids in a schoolyard tripping over each other in an attempt to battle. We were nothing more than two fools, and we were falling forever. Mr. Scorpio hit the ground beside me and let out a scream. His shock rod clattered out of his hand. And for just a moment, we all lay there, the three of us. We just lay out in the alley and looked up at the stars. Then I pulled myself up and I got a bit of an idea as to what had happened. Mr. Scorpio had landed on his own weapon, and the shock had sent him into, well, shock. It had left him curled up on the ground, lying next to Tom like they were a couple of sleeping babes ready to be tucked in for the night. Then Mr. Scorpio let out a weak groan that sounded like pain and confusion. I've never been hit with a strong dose of electricity, but I understand it's quite a painful, confusing experience. And then I was standing over him. I was standing over Mr. Scorpio, there, in the alley, and things were starting to look a little strange to me. It was like everything in the distance was a blurred watercolor painting that somebody had left out in the rain, but everything close up was in super sharp focus, hyper 3D. Maybe that's what superpowers feel like, when you can see between molecules and sense danger before it happens. Mr. Scorpio groaned again. And then I had my shock rod in my hands. I don't remember picking it up, but it sort of made sense. Mr. Scorpio groaned, and beneath the mask of Dr. Destroyo, a mask stained with blood and bile, Tom twitched. I had the shock rod in my hands, and my friend's killer at my feet. I'd like to say it was a long, cold moment, but it wasn't. It was a sudden thing, like a rush of impulses and adrenaline. It wasn't like firing a gun. It wasn't like pulling a trigger and making something happen somewhere far away. It was a decisive and personal act. It was emotion which had to be carried all the way through by me, by my body, by my hands. This was involvement. This was a decision and a physical manifestation of that decision. I jammed the metal nubs of the shock rod into Mr. Scorpio's mouth. His eyes opened, and he looked up at me. Like lovers, we locked eyes, and then I depressed the trigger, and then I leaned down onto the stick with all my weight. I pushed down and felt the shock rod puncturing through the man's throat. How many volts went through him? All of them, I guess. And I just stood there. I stood over top of him, and I held the button down, and I pressed the stick towards the back of his head as it burned its way out through the inside of him. Mr. Scorpio tried to scream, but his mouth was full of cheap plastic and battery-powered electric death. The air was full of the smell of burnt hair and blood, and Mr. Scorpio's eyes were poaching in their sockets. He sort of screamed, but it wasn't a real sound. It was more like a smoldering gurgle. It was like he wasn't really there. Maybe I wasn't either. Maybe it was all just a pantomime or a fictional tale. Maybe it was a lie or an illusion, a faded hologram of murders in the night. But it wasn't. He was there. I was there. Tom was there, at least slightly. And I was killing a man. Eventually, I felt the shock rod go dead. At first, the handle was humming in my hands, and then the juice ran out and everything slowed to a stop. Mr. Scorpio had stopped. No, it was more than that. Mr. Scorpio was dead. Tom, somehow, was still alive. He was still moving, but just barely. He was convulsing feebly. He still had the mask on. Dr. Destroyo's mask. So I sat there, on the alley floor, with my best friend, and the man who killed him. I sat there and I watched Tom die. It took another 2 minutes. 2 minutes of fingers trying to scrape their way through solid concrete. About 120 seconds of blood trickling out through his nose and mouth, of Tom barely moving. And then he stopped moving. And then he was dead. They were both dead. They were both dead, and I was all alone in the alley. And it was time to go home. Chapter 10. Once I was home, I stripped off all my clothes and I put them in a garbage bag. Then I climbed into the shower. Crying in the shower is really nice. The water takes care of the tears and the snot and all the mess. You could just scream and cry and cower into the water. For a little while, nothing matters. There's just you and the rush of wet warmth against your skin. I turned the hot water up, higher and higher. My flesh started to glow bright red like a stoplight, and then a darker red like a cooked lobster. The hot water hurt, but in this weird, distant way that I couldn't really feel. It was one of those things that was happening around me, but not to me. I could feel the water burning, but I didn't seem to register that it was my skin that the water was burning. So, I'd killed a man, and my best friend was dead. And I'd killed a guy, and my roommate was dead. And I'd killed somebody, and somebody else was also dead. Dead, killed, dead. What was the difference? Killed, dead, killed. Did it matter at all? Was there any kind of inherent sense of justice to any of these acts? Was there some scorekeeper somewhere somehow keeping tabs on everything, metering out who'd done right and who'd done wrong? I looked at my hands. They were covered in blood. Not literal blood, but the kind of blood that drives madness into the minds of Shakespearean queens. And I could still see it. I could still see the blood of the masked man on my hands. Born again, went the movie trailer of my life. Baptized in blood. Hero blood. Vigilante blood. The blood of the streets. Hero blood. Vigilante blood. The blood of the streets. I wasn't supposed to be a killer. That's not who or what I was. I was supposed to be funny and lame, not dangerous. I was a slacker, a loser. I was just a joker, not something grandiose and awful. I was too lazy and useless to be a real threat to anybody. I was too nice, too easygoing. I had a comfy couch and half-hearted dreams. I wasn't the sort of person who'd murder somebody. It wasn't in my makeup, my profile, my character class. It wasn't me. Eventually, some small part of my brain suggested really quietly that I'd been in the water long enough, the nerves of my skin sending me vague messages of discomfort which I could almost feel. I turned the water off and walked out of the shower, dripping everywhere without really thinking about anything. I wrapped a towel around my body and walked into the kitchen where the microwave's clock told me that I'd been under the water for over an hour. This is shock, I said aloud to myself, trying to gain power over my mental state by acknowledging it. I am in shock. You can't feel numb, you know that? Because numb is not feeling anything at all. So you can't feel numb. You can only be numb. You can only be numb, like you can feel that you feel nothing at all. I poured myself a cup of coffee from an old pot on the stove and heated the cup in the microwave. Once the coffee was steaming, I added milk. and then I just let the two liquids settle into each other. When I took a sip, it tasted terrible, but necessary. Across the countertop, I noticed a large blue mug. It wasn't my mug. I never drank from it. It was somebody else's mug. Somebody else's big blue mug. I stared at the mug. I knew it belonged to somebody, but I couldn't remember who. Somebody who was gone. Somebody who'd been my friend, who was gone forever. I stared at the cup like I was waiting for it to give me a sign, like it had fallen from the heavens, a sacred gift sent down from a higher state of existence. I stared at the cup. It was Tom's cup. He used to drink from it every morning. I sank to the kitchen floor, spilling half my coffee down my towel and my legs. The coffee felt like it wanted to burn me, but I was still numb from the shower and the shock. I was well beyond feeling anything. I sank to the kitchen floor, spilling half my coffee down my towels and my legs. I left the coffee-stained towels on the floor and walked into the living room entirely naked. I set my empty cup onto the coffee table and I located the remote control for the television. I tried to reach for the weed, for the remnants of our pot and something to smoke it in, but I couldn't quite make it. My arms just weren't long enough, and my will wasn't strong enough. Instead, I just sat there, curled in a little ball on the couch, stone cold sober, watching TV until dawn. I finally fell asleep just as the sun began to rise. Dr. Destroyo is written and produced by Hank Pattison for the Death by Media Man podcast channel. You can subscribe to the Death by Media Man podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud. If you enjoyed this, please leave us a like or a comment and tell a friend. And if you'd like to support the Death by Media Man channel with your money, there's a link to our Patreon in the description of this program. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next installment of Dr. Destroyo.